and welcome back to another week on the Brush by Brandy YouTube channel. And this week we're working on this piece that's behind me. And this piece is so funny because I've had this piece in my inventory for forever and it looks like a super cute piece of furniture, but at some point someone had tried to refinish it and probably did more damage than good. So it came to me in really rough condition, and I rarely get pieces of furniture that I'm like, no, not going to work on that. And this was one that almost met that criteria. So I'm going to show you different ways that you can work with furniture that has damage in the finishes, ways that you can camouflage that and still upgrade it. And this is exactly one of those. So this one I'm actually using a brand new collection from Redesign with Prima. This is a collaboration they did with Annie Sloan. This is her Swedish posy collection. So we're going to use the Swedish posy paper and the mold from Annie Sloan. We're going to use Annie Sloan paint. It's going to be a textured finish. Of course, there's some decoupage on this one, a really pretty paint treatment. So it's got a lot of fun techniques, and it totally transformed this piece to one that I'm actually thrilled with how it came out. So I hope you guys are too. Let's get started. Here's where I started on this piece. It looks really cute in photos, but what you can't tell is all this veneer is chipping and peeling, and a lot of it has been removed already. So this is going to be a job for Bondo. I started out by scraping away all that old veneer, but it left a lot of chunks and pitting in the existing wood. So I'm going to use Bondo to go ahead and fill in some of those spots. To mix up Bondo, you mix the paste along with the activator. The activator is that red portion, and then stir it up. You don't want to mix in too large of batches because this stuff does set up pretty quickly. And then you want to move pretty quickly by applying it to the front of the piece. In this case, I'm just going to scrape it over the front and try to fill in some of those old designs that really don't work anymore because all that veneer is missing. Now I'm going to mix up another small batch of it with that activator, and there's more spots to do. Most of the body on this needed a good coat of Bondo. So this is one of the drawer fronts on this vanity, and I did go ahead and coat these in a gray primer, and that just helped me to not see only the wood grain. It gave me a nice clean even background so that I could apply the Bondo and see where exactly needed to be filled. You can see all the pitting in this wood. This is just from the veneer being removed. Sometimes that glue will just take spots, and the wood that's underneath the veneer usually isn't as good a quality, but the Bondo is going to smooth this out nice and evenly, and I've got some other tricks in plan for this vanity. Here is what my Bondo looked like after the application. I need to let this dry, and then I'm going to have to sand down this whole entire body. This was so much of a project, you guys. But now that I have that sanded down, it's time to talk about adding some finishes over the top. So I chose this new collection from Annie Sloan and Redesign with Prima called Swedish Posy. And of course, I'm going to use some Annie Sloan paint colors that coordinate with the colors that are in her new decoupage paper. So to do that, I'm going to mix some Annie Sloan paint along with some salt wash. I added some salt wash into a dish, and I'm going to stir those together to get a nice thickened paint mix. That's because I'm going to use a textured paint finish. The overall texture on this is much smoother, but it's still not perfect, so what better way to hide it than by using a textured paint finish. I stir these together until I get this creamy mixture, and then I'm going to apply it over top using a stippling motion. And I'm just doing this using a chip brush. I chose a chip brush because stippling can be really hard on your brushes, and so I don't want to do this using my good brushes. The places that I planned on using this textured paint finish, I wasn't too worried if I filled them perfectly with my Bondo, and that's because this texture is going to camouflage a lot. So don't be afraid to use texture to your benefit when you've got finishes on existing pieces like this. This stippled finish actually ends up being pretty smooth, so I don't worry about it being rough or too bumpy. The top of this is definitely still usable, even with a lightly textured finish. For places like the sides of the piece, I'm going to use decoupage to camouflage some of the texture that was left in this piece. So this just has the primer underneath, and I didn't put any of my paint finish on this because I'm going to cover it in the paper. So I'm using Redesign with Prima decoupage gel, and I'm going to apply a nice even coat over the side of this piece. I pre-cut my decoupage paper to fit just exactly to this side, and then I'm going to go ahead and press it into that decoupage gel. I can trim any excess once it's down. I'm going to use this scraper tool to press it into that decoupage gel. And once I've got it nice and seated into that decoupage gel, I'm going to come back with my gel and apply another coat over the top of my paper. This is going to fill in any texture in that paper and give me a nice, smooth, even finish. This is also going to serve as my sealer. I like to do 2 coats of this, so I'm going to let this first coat dry, and then I'm going to come back and apply a second coat of that decoupage gel for my sealer as well. Once that decoupage gel is dry, I can go ahead and seal this with any top coat that I want to match the existing finish on my piece so that I have a nice, even, and uniform sheen. I cut my paper just a little bit larger than the actual side of this piece, so I need to trim it, and I'm doing that using this Surf Prep brad pad. I'm going to go ahead and lightly sand the edge of this. I just sand in one direction. I don't want to use a sawing motion because that can have a tendency to fray my paper, and it's going to remove. You can see I'm able to pull off the excess right away. One of the other pieces in this collection is a mold from Redesign with Prima, also in the Swedish Posy collection. So I'm going to mix up some amazing casting resin, and we're going to pour some of this sweet little mold. I mix equal parts of A and B, stir them together for about 30 seconds, and then I can go ahead and pour this into my mold. I plan on using these as some hardware backs. I did pour a little bit too much resin, and so I don't want that to go to waste. I'm just going to pour those little buttons as well, but I don't think I'll be using them on this piece. After about 10 minutes, the resin has turned white, and I can come back and pop those right out of my mold and save those buttons for later. Now I'm going to drill out the centers of this little applique, and these are going to be my hardware backs. I do this while my resin is nice and fresh so that it's easy to drill out. Now I'm going to add some paint to this resin. This is Cambrian Blue from Annie Sloan. I chose to paint right on top of my fresh resin with 2 coats of the Cambrian Blue, but you can also prime if you prefer. I added my decoupage paper to the sides of my piece, but I'm also going to add them to these drawer fronts as well. And for this particular drawer, I needed to paint around the edges first, but I left the centers in my original primer. I'm going to go ahead and fill this area in using my Redesign with Prima decoupage gel, and then I'm going to place the paper right over the top, but only on the center portion of this drawer. I chose to do just the center and then outline the drawer using my textured paint finish, and that's because it can be really complicated to apply a decoupage paper into some of these crevices when you've got a molded detail like this drawer has. So I cut the piece to fit the center of this drawer, put my decoupage gel underneath, and now I'm going to apply that coat over the top and let it dry. I'm going to repeat the same process with some of the smaller drawers on the top of this piece as well. Applying that same Redesign with Prima decoupage gel underneath, a nice thick coat because I want that paper to really seat into it. And then when I apply the coat over the top, it's going to match up with the coat that's underneath and really encapsulate this paper so that it's nice and attached and protected. In this case, I didn't trim the paper around the edges, and that's because I don't have a molded detail around this drawer. So I can just use my sanding block. This is an 80 grit, and I'm just pulling downward on it in one direction to trim my paper perfectly to the size of this drawer. This is a great shot right here to see some of the tones that are in this paper from Annie Sloan. I see Scandinavian pink in there, some vintage duck egg, that Cambrian blue that I ended up using, Svenska blue is in there. There's any number of different colors that you can pull out of the Annie Sloan paint line and get them to match into all the tones of this. And I think that's really fun because it makes it really easy to coordinate your looks together. And then also I can coordinate them within the collection itself using the mold and then the matching transfer that are in this Swedish Posy collection. The top of this drawer has my primer on it, but of course I want that to match my paint color, and so I'm going to go ahead and paint the edge of my drawer as well. Now that I've cast enough of these little emblems for the front of my drawers, I want to go ahead and decorate these a little bit. I used a knob to hold them in place and attach them using some Type-On Quick and Thick adhesive over the top of my paper. I dry brushed a little bit of Svenska blue over that Cambrian blue, and now I'm dry brushing a little bit of aubusson blue on just the edges of this emblem, and it's really going to bring out some of those details. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Annie Sloan's black wax, and I'm going to darken up those paint colors as well to make them a little bit more dramatic. You can see when I look straight onto this with those sweet little glass knobs in the center how much detail those paint colors bring out. Now I'm going to do some dry brushing over my existing paint finish too. I started out with vintage duck egg as my base color, and now I'm dry brushing a little bit of Svenska blue over the top. This is going to pick up some of that texture in my paint finish that I got with that stippling pattern. It gives me a little bit of variation, almost this marbling look. I'm using my natural bristle chip brush, and I'm just laying off the brush onto some paper, and I'm just dry brushing over the top of that texture. Dry brushing means I have very little paint on my brush, just enough to pick up a little bit of that detail. Now I'm going to come down and do some of this onto the lower sections of my drawer as well. This dry brushing technique looks very subtle on camera, but in person it just looks like kind of a marbleized look, added some kind of veining over the top of my stippled texture. I want to pull out the drawers and make sure I get underneath there as well so that there's no seam or harsh line where I stop doing my paint finish underneath those drawers. You can see also at this point how well that textured paint finish camouflaged any of the flaws that I had in the surface of this piece. You really can't even tell anymore that it was less than perfect to begin with. And then this little bit of dry brushing is going to bring out some of those accents along the edges. I chose to dry brush a little bit of the Svenska blue and also a little bit of the Cambrian blue along the corners just to make them a little bit darker than my body. Cambrian blue is in the satin finish collection from Annie Sloan Paint, and I'm also using some of her chalk paint. And this is a great way to show that you can layer these two types of paint together and use all of the colors to complement each other, and they really work well together. My last color that I'm going to dry brush on these corners is a little bit of aubusson blue. You can see how it just deepens up the color in those corners and emphasizes them just a little bit. Let's do a little bit on the side of this piece as well. Turning to the side, I have my base down of the vintage duck egg mixed with a little bit of the salt wash, and then I dry brushed a little bit of that Svenska blue over the top. Now I'm dry brushing some of that Cambrian blue. This is a more subtle contrast between the base colors, and so I'm just going to carry this a little bit out onto the body. The final step I'm going to do is to dry brush a little bit of that aubusson blue. I lay off my brush onto that scrap piece of paper, and I'm just going to dry brush a little bit and pick up some of that texture. You can see how this darkens up the edges and just gives me some layered contrast. After that aubusson blue is on, I went ahead and came back with a little bit more of that Cambrian blue, and this is just going to unify the colors a little bit more, soften down the tones a little bit, and kind of brush them together. The final step in this layering process is going to be to add a little bit of Annie Sloan black wax, and I'm going to do this down here on this base with just a small artist brush, a little bit of Annie Sloan's black wax, and I'm going to add it right into this crevice. You can see I've also dry brushed a little bit of these colors along this base as well, and then I'm going to dry brush a little bit of my paint over the top of that black wax just to kind of unify it. This is really fun to kind of layer a little bit of wax and a little bit of paint to get all these different looks, and this layered effect gives so much depth to the paint finish. I use black wax on pretty much all of my pieces, and I use it in very small quantities because a little bit goes a long way. The next thing I need to do is I'm going to accentuate some of the original hardware. I added some glass knobs on the base of this, but I'm going to use the original knobs on the top. I painted them in Annie Sloan Cambrian blue so that they match the background that's on the paper. It did take 2 coats of the Cambrian blue to get full coverage on these knobs, and I'm not going to worry about sealing them because this is Annie Sloan satin paint, which has a built-in sealer. The final step was to seal up the painted portions on this piece, and I did use 2 coats of Annie Sloan's lacquer to seal those portions. I didn't worry about the paper portions because those were already sealed in my decoupage gel. Here is the final project, and I staged this with a cute white vintage looking mirror from my collection and a gold stool. It's a little bit shabby chic, very feminine, very whimsical. This was a really fun piece to work on, and I think it's a huge improvement from where this one started, which was near the trash pile. So what do you guys think? I hope this was a fun makeover for you too. The Swedish Posy collection from Annie Sloan is adorable, and I'll think I'll be using it again. You guys can find more Brush by Brandy on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube. And if you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll click that subscribe button for more weekly painting tutorials here at Brush by Brandy.